Great, thank you Travis and Joshua and for having such an appropriate name given your new position. I think that's great, and to the Center for Data Innovation. We're really delighted to be here. I'm Brandon Pustejovsky. I'm the Chief Data Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development. I'm very excited to speak to you this evening about USAID's open data policy. I'll try to speak through my notes and drive the PowerPoint at the same time, so we'll see how ambidextrous I actually am. If you're not familiar with USAID, USAID is the lead government agency that works to end extreme poverty and enable democratic societies worldwide to realize their potential. And in order to do that, we work with a variety of partners spanning academia, nonprofits, private enterprise with a presence in approximately 85 countries worldwide. I know many of that demographic are represented here this evening. But at the same time, this broad global presence carries very interesting implications for our data management. We provide funding via grants, contracts, cooperative agreements, and other mechanisms to our partners who then implement programs with us for international development. And the partners then collect data and store data in remote locations like the one you see on your screen. And this is actually a site previously used by one of our implementing partners in South Sudan. And the data storage location is on the laptop there on your screen. So accounting for all of USAID's and USAID-funded data is rife with policy and logistical challenges. But yet, we certainly view this as the wave of the future, and I know many of you do, which is why you're here this evening after speaking with many of you. Not only accounting for U.S. government data, but making as much of it publicly available as we possibly can while still ensuring proper protections for privacy, security, and so on. But USAID is certainly not alone in its open data efforts. They're part of a much larger global context that many of you are probably familiar with. And many multilateral entities are acknowledging the centrality of data and transparency, particularly in the post-2015 development agenda. For example, in August of 2014, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed a special data revolution advisory group to close data gaps in support of the post-2015 development agenda, and they just released their report close to a month ago. At the fourth high-level Forum on Aid Effectiveness in Busan, South Korea, in November 2011, the United States, and this is not USAID, but the U.S. government as a whole announced that it had joined the International Aid Transparency Initiative, or IATI, which aims to improve foreign assistance transparency via a common data reporting standard. That's U.S. government-wide. In the United States, again, not USAID, but the U.S. government, is a member of the Open Government Partnership, and President Obama spoke there recently during the UN General Assembly meetings in New York. And this is a consortium of over 60 countries committed to making their governments more open, accountable, and responsive to citizens. Open data is simply becoming the norm. The United States governments and around the world are acknowledging that openness with our data and engagement with citizens and the general public leads to better services, economic growth, entrepreneurship, and innovative solutions to complex problems, and really improved stewardship of public resources. And we demonstrate that level of transparency. But there's also a domestic reality, and open data has domestic roots as well. And many of you probably know that in January of 2009, President Obama signed the Memorandum on Transparency and Open Government. This was the very first executive action to bear the president's signature and committed the U.S. to an unprecedented level of openness in government. And more recently, in May 2013, the president signed an executive order making all new and modernized U.S. government information resources open and machine-readable by default. I'm just going to say that one again. Open and machine-readable by default, which is a huge paradigm shift. This means that it's no longer incumbent upon the American taxpayer to file requests for data generated by their own tax-paying funds, but it is incumbent upon the U.S. government to proactively release data funded by the American taxpayer. Insofar, again, as doing so does not violate exceptions related to privacy, security, and so on. So this is a huge paradigm shift, and one which USAID is looking at building into the culture of its operations, the very fabric of how we operate, through the release of its open data policy, which we affectionately call ADS 579, which I'm sure means a world to all of you. But our open data policy is something that is changing the operations of our agency, and one of the reasons we're here this evening. So what is the state of play of open data at USAID, and what did that look like prior to the issuance of this policy? Essentially, the diagram you see on the screen would focus on USAID through the logo at the top, issuing funds to implementing partners through grants, contracts, cooperative agreements, as noted on the right side of your screen, who would then report progress as they implemented programs. They would generate international development programs, which would produce data, and then they would report data back to USAID through reports, through key indicator data, through corporate systems, but not usually the raw data associated with those reports. So if you notice on the right side of the screen, we're generating program data on the far right, but the information coming back to USAID was generally narrative reports through a platform known as the Development Experience Clearinghouse. But we would not generally get the raw data underlying those reports. I also made this slide on a dare to see how many graphics I can include on a single slide. So the issue, obviously, is that the narrative reports are not open and machine readable. In many cases, they are PDF documents. USAID was created in the 1960s. In some cases, they were scanned copies even of typewritten documents on a typewriter. A typewriter is a thing that has a... Anyway, so despite being a data-driven agency, we were analyzing global trends and evaluation data without comprehensively inventorying those data sets for future learning. In essence, our missions worldwide had access to a vast treasure trove of data that they were not systematically saving or storing. And there are a few reasons this dynamic actually developed. While we insisted on narrative and aggregate level reporting, we were not asking for the raw data. We simply weren't asking for it. It was there, but we did not collectively ask for it or specify the data as a deliverable in the awards. The report would be a deliverable, but not necessarily the data. There are also conflicting views about who actually owned the data. The reality is that our partners, not USAID, generally own the data. And that was news to many of us in the halls of USAID. We had to do some investigation into that. But our partners own the data. But the standard language in most of our awards indicate that USAID has unlimited usage rights to the data. We're simply not exercising those rights. There are other issues, such as non-standard business processes for obtaining the data, questions about data quality, and even the definition of data pose further challenges. So USAID's open data policy addressed each of these head-on so that USAID can gain systematic access to the raw material, the raw data, needed to fuel our investments in science, technology, innovation, and partnership. And sometimes we're actually asked what process we use to establish an open data policy at USAID, and I know some of you have asked that here. So let me speak to that just for a moment to give some insight into that process. So some of you may know that USAID issued an evaluation policy in January of 2011 that far predated this open data mandate from OMB. And that guided the systematic collection and analysis of information and evidence about program performance and impact. So this policy predates current open data efforts, but it essentially said, this 2011 evaluation policy at USAID said that data collected by USAID or one of the agency's contractors or grantees for the purpose of an evaluation must be uploaded and stored in a central database. As we began implementing that policy, however, in 2011, and preparing for the creation of the database, the need to actually incorporate a data submission requirement in our awards with implementing partners became more and more evident. Simultaneously, in 2012, we began hearing about the pending executive order on open data, and it began to make sense to bring these two things together, the evaluation policy and a pending open data policy for the agency as a whole. And so in order to begin doing this, we began creating an information governance body to manage information and data at USAID. And after the executive order was released in 2013, that is the red box there on the top of your screen toward the left, we devoted our efforts to actually complying with that policy. And by August of 2013, we were able to start drafting submission requirements for our grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts. By September of 2013, so that's a year ago now, we formalized a body known as the Information Governance Committee at USAID to ensure that the agency adopts a unified, collaborative, and transparent approach to data collection and publication. By November, in compliance with the OMB policy, we published our first data to usaid.gov/data. That is our open data website, usaid.gov/data, in compliance with the executive order, and that site now has over 70 data sets at the site for public use. In this year, sort of a ragtag group at USAID that had been working on all of this became an official working group under this Information Governance Committee. And in February of 2014, some of the heavy lifting really began as we started drafting the umbrella policy under which we would make these modifications to every award that we would issue worldwide from 2014 on. So this included drafting and testing a data clearance process in March of 2014. That's this sort of mauve colored box, for the second from the bottom on the left, and socializing the policy for feedback in April and beginning the initial policy approval process in May. In June and July, we made final revisions to the policy based on feedback from USAID operating units as a whole to make sure that this was a collaborative agency-wide process. Then we circulated the policy for final clearance in August of this year, a matter of months ago. In September, another critical piece happened. My wife had a baby. This had been pre-approved, and that was routed through a separate data clearance process altogether. But by the end of September, thankfully the policy had been approved in time for fiscal year 15, which began on October 1st. And this meant that all USAID awards issued on or after October 1st, 2014 now contain a requirement to submit data generated with USAID funding to USAID. And in November, we really started ramping up efforts to socialize the policy, which is one of the reasons we're here this evening. So thank you for the opportunity. So what, you're probably asking, what does this policy actually do? And so what's different now from the paradigm you saw on the screen before? As we mentioned, the policy defines USAID's data governance structure. For organizations right now trying to deal with open data, they're finding in many cases they need a structure that sort of brings these many conversations together to ensure that there's buy-in across the organization as a whole, and that we provide a forum to vet questions and concerns at a high level, and to coordinate agency-wide policy socialization and rollout. And they have been instrumental in giving us top cover for actually rolling out the policy and ensuring that we have buy-in across our missions worldwide. It also establishes the Development Data Library. That's our website where we're releasing the data at usaid.gov/data. And that page now contains a mechanism by which our partners can, in fact, submit the raw data now to USAID. And we'll be investing in that more over the next year to ensure that we make more of that publicly available. It does outline, critically, a formal data clearance process to ensure that each data set is vetted for privacy, security, and other considerations allowable by law. And I know some of you have already asked about that this evening. That is a very rigorous process to make sure that we are not releasing any sensitive information that could jeopardize any of our partners that we value very much, or jeopardize the security of our nation or of USAID operations. And also, it creates data stewards in every USAID operating unit. This is critical in the sense that those data stewards provide policy guidance to their local mission, whether it be in Liberia, Uganda, Honduras, or wherever, and insisting that open data principles are incorporated into operations and making sure that the data is cleared for public release. So how are we actually doing this? Primarily through changes, as I mentioned, through procurement and changes to our awards that we issue. The policy has been over a year in the making. And as an agency that deals with sensitive global issues such as Ebola and the Syria crisis, questions have been rampant in terms of data protection. And given that we primarily work through partners, intrinsic changes to our procurement mechanisms were essential, which we were able to effect thanks to our colleagues in the Office of Acquisition and Assistance and the Office of the General Counsel, who were also instrumental in this policy. So essentially all awards issued now on or after October 1st, 2014 require our implementing partners to submit their data to the Development Data Library. And that language essentially says that that must be submitted in an open and machine-readable format insofar as that data was created under the performance of a USAID award. And that also includes subcontractors or subawardees at any tier down that chain. So the key is, given that the global location of our partners has been really, this would have been next to impossible given the global location of our partners. The fact that this needs to trickle down to all of our awards is instrumental, and other agencies don't necessarily have this challenge in the way they operate. But now with that requirement in each of our awards, we're actually able to bring that data in-house at USAID, make it available, and our contracting officers and agreement officers can then ensure that that data is submitted and then to vet it through the clearance process. We're also asking that the agency as a whole think about data differently. For example, looking at data, as I mentioned, as a word deliverable. So, for example, a deliverable would not simply be a vaccination program in location X, but all data sets created in support of a vaccination program in location X would be part of that deliverable. And our data stewards are key ambassadors for communicating this requirement, and we have more than 100 of those as of today at USAID, located in the various missions around the world. Many of you also know that we recently established a new entity within USAID known as the U.S. Global Development Lab. Our colleagues from the lab are key players in our open data efforts. To tell you more about the lab and its role in open data, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Laura Hughes.
Thank you, Brandon. So just to give you a very brief overview of the Global Development Lab, what we do at the core is really to take the application of science, technology, innovation, and partnership, and to apply it to development to solve problems. So what we really want to do is take data and turn it into an asset that can be used to help make decisions. And so to that extent, our role in open data is really engaging with a number of communities, namely the academic ones and other researchers, to help promote the use of our data. And so some of the questions that we're really focusing on right now in the lab is really how do we connect the people who actually make and generate the data with people who actually want to use it. And this is rife with a number of problems, 3 of which I've highlighted here, and some of which Brandon alluded to. So the first is that, simply put, opening data is really hard and it takes a lot of time. There are lots of policy and logistical sort of complexities which Brandon discussed, which makes it a difficult process. And so one of the things that we're really focusing on now is how can we actually generate data that people are actually interested in using so that the complexities and the logistics of this pay off in the future. The second is that cataloging the breadth of data is very challenging. So we work in over 85 countries, which means that we have over 100 operating units, which are each generating their own data. So how do we actually know all the data that we have so we can prioritize what we're actually going to open up? And then the last is it's really difficult to understand who our audience for this data is. How are they going to use it, and how can we help meet that need? And so our approach to sort of addressing these challenges is really threefold. So the first is that we've been doing a lot of work, especially in the past few months, really trying to understand the needs of our audience. So doing one-on-one interviews and getting a sense of what they actually care about and how we can actually do that. And that really informs the second 2 things. So secondly, we're trying to develop guidance on how to make data useful to our audience. Getting more data out there is great, but what we really want is data that people can actually use and engage with and learn something from. And so we're working to develop ways to better support that so that data sets actually are useful to the public. And then the third is we're really working to create opportunities to connect people together. So connect the people who generate and connect the people who use the data. And I'm going to talk about a couple things that we're doing on that front. I'd like to point out that this is really an ongoing process, and it's something that we're continuing to learn from. And so I thought I would share a few things that we've learned thus far in our approach. And so I'm going to first give you a brief overview of some of the main conclusions we have from talking to a bunch of our stakeholders. So I started this process looking at members, everything from data science to academics to journalists, to ask them, what data sets do you want so we could really prioritize? And what I found was actually sort of more surprising than that. In some sense, it really didn't matter what sort of data we have, but what was more important was that the data is high quality and actually well documented so that they can use it. And I'll give you a better sense of sort of how we're thinking about what data quality is and what is good data. But what is really important, and it's amazing to me that this is really, in our experience thus far, it's not specific to a specific group. It's pretty wide in our entire broad audience, is that everyone cares about standards. What makes data valuable to them is that they can actually combine it with other information, things that they care about, things that another organization has already done, to get a broader, more holistic picture of what's actually going on. And so that really speaks to the fact that the data has to be standardized in a way. Thirdly, it's pretty interesting because most of the time, data producers and consumers aren't really very aware of exactly what they're doing in either fields. So my background is in research, and a lot of the researchers that I spoke to really aren't aware that USAID necessarily has data that they would be interested in. And on the flip side, data generators aren't really connected to the researchers. So this is a paraphrase quote from someone that I was talking to. So we know the broad stakeholders, but we're not able to figure out who would want our data and how to get it to them. And so I think that's a really interesting opportunity for us to actually connect those people together so that we can connect the people who are generating the data and those who want to use it. And then the last, I think it's really a potential for USAID to provide guidance on a lot of these issues. So how do you manage knowledge? How do you go from collecting data to transmitting it to the public? And how do you create standards for data collection? So that being said, what actually makes data useful? And this is presented as sort of a hierarchy in some sense. And I think the most common thing that we've discovered is that consistency is really key to having data be valuable to other people. So this is another paraphrase quote from someone that I was talking to. The largest problem isn't whether or not the data are open, but whether they're standardized and comparable. So lots of information exists out there. You know, the whole data revolution makes it very easy to collect data. But if you don't know what exactly it means, then it becomes less valuable. And to that point, the external community really values an explicit relationship with data. So the use of unique and consistent IDs to connect the data. So for instance, if you have two separate databases which are looking at households, it's very easy to combine those into one data set. But what's hard is to have the understanding that the person in row 1 is the same person in row 14. And so those relationships need to be made explicit and well-defined so that you know how data sets relate to each other. The third thing is that data is often useful with scale. So we fund research and contracts in a host of different countries, which means that we can do things on a scale larger than many other entities. And so as a result, there's a huge opportunity for us to leverage this data to compare across multiple countries. And to the same extent, data that are difficult or impossible to access in any other way. So for instance, if you're collecting data from a very remote location in a forest, that's not accessible to every person, and that's sort of a unique spin that USAID perhaps has. Another thing is, which I alluded to, which comes to the core, is documentation. So how data are collected is the most value added, but it's the most difficult part. So really at the core of this, the question is, how do you make information understandable to someone else? And it's interesting, so the journalistic community, which is a community I'm not too familiar with, has a strange phrase which I thought was really interesting. So they want to be able to interview the data. And so what they mean by that is they want to understand, how is it manipulated? What happened to it? How did you go from the actual collection point to however it's presented in the report? And so if they don't know that, then it gets into questions of trustworthiness, or how do you compare it to something else, or how did you actually calculate the value? And it's interesting because this is the same that's true in the research and academic community, but just under a different guise. If you don't know where the data comes from, you're probably not going to be able to use it. And then the last two things are really that ideally data needs to be timely, which is a huge surprise, and then it needs to be easily accessible. So it needs to be able to be found at the drop of a hat, which is something that we're working towards. So I think the really interesting thing from these sort of interviews is it really provides us with two approaches going forward. So the first is sort of a more long-term vision. So using this, we can start to develop ways looking at, with our new open data policy, figuring out how do we make data more understandable and more shareable from the start. So understanding that things like documentation are going to be a huge part of that, and really implementing that from the get-go, we can define best practices for that going forward. The second part, which is more in the immediate term, is we can use this to really prioritize how we engage with other people and what they're interested in. And so I'm going to give you a brief overview of two areas in which we're working on that. So one of the ways that we've been working on public engagement is through the use of hackathons. And I thought I'd give you a brief little vignette of a hackathon that we did a couple years ago called Hacking for Hunger. And so what this hackathon was all about was, it started with trying to get a bunch of stakeholders together and getting a brainstorming session about what sort of questions we can ask about the data. And one thing that came out of that was the fact that the Grameen Foundation had a whole host of data, and they were working with the Palantir organization in Palo Alto, California, to analyze the data. And so what is really interesting about this hackathon is the value of how bringing together the right partners can lead to really interesting insights. So what they did was Grameen collected all this data using community knowledge workers. So these are people who go around house to house in Uganda and interview people with a bunch of questions, which is all collected using an Android phone. So in this data, they had about 28,000 geolocated soil samples from Uganda. And they handed it over to Palantir, which then combined it with soil types, population, and income. And what they noticed was that you could use this to very robustly track an outbreak of crop or livestock diseases. And so the really exciting thing is they were able to use this to predict, since diseases follow a very sort of standardized pattern, they could predict a maggot outbreak in soybeans in Uganda. And using the community knowledge workers, they could then go out to the field and say, hey, we're noticing that there's a spread of maggots. Here's how you identify it. Here's what you can do to prevent it if you don't already have it, and here's how you treat it. And so it's a really interesting example of the potential of using open data and really bringing together these two disparate communities, the people who are collecting the data and the people who have really strong analytical skills to do it. And sort of taking a step back and taking a sort of more broad view of what we've learned from these sorts of hackathons, are there really sort of three ingredients to success, which are not all-inclusive, but three things that we've highlighted as being useful for developing a successful hackathon. So the first is to have a really defined problem. So it needs to be a problem that is based in an actual need, and something that is specific and realistic during the time frame. And to that end, you can develop parts of an app or parts of a solution within a hackathon, but it really requires a lot of prep work both on the outset and afterwards to really get it into a product that can be used in the actual field. So the second point is that it's really important to have a clearly defined entry point for non-experts. And what I mean by that is that it's, I think one of the real values that we see in these hackathons is the ability to bring in new people who are really interested in this area, but perhaps don't know exactly how they can contribute. So people who have skills like technology might really be interested in this problem, but they have no idea where to start. And so you need to have a clearly defined path for them to actually enter the data so that they understand how they can contribute to it. And the third, which is really a summation of everything that I've been talking about, is the value of really mixing multiple viewpoints. So the way that we tend to approach this is by having a mix of people who know this area very well, so people who are subject matter experts. Second, people who actually know the specific data sets well, and then third, people who have some sort of technical capabilities to contribute to it. And it's really important, especially to have the people who have subject matter expertise so that they can provide context and really guide what's actually important to people in the field. So my background is more or less as a data scientist, but that doesn't mean that I know how stunting is calculated or how people actually measure it in the field and what limitations there are in the data. And so it's really valuable to have the intersection of all those groups together to form one cohesive picture. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we're actually hosting a hackathon coming up, which you guys are all very welcome to come to. We would love to have any and all your input. So it's going to be on January 29th and 30th at Open GovHub. I'm sorry I don't have a website, but feel free to contact me or Brandon, and we can provide you with information on how to sign up for that. And one of the things we're really looking at doing in that hackathon is integrating a lot of our data sets together to figure out how they can be combined to provide a more cohesive picture of USAID funding. So a second thing that we're also working with on trying to figure out how to connect supply and demand of data is the idea of an open data grant. And this is something that we're starting to develop now, and we would really love input, especially from people who are data producers or generators. So the idea behind that is that we identify a group of high priority data sets, which are really focused on ones that are interesting and relevant and useful for the broader community. And then applicants would write a proposal. If I were given this data, here's all the cool things that I would do with it. And so using that, we would work to open those data and really create a community which collaborates on this data to provide sort of all these connections that we're talking about, providing the people who have the subject matter expertise along with the more sort of technological background to it. And so we would love to have any input. You're welcome to email me, or we've also created a short survey on it, which is at the link right below. So that's sort of a very broad and brief overview of what we're doing in the sector of trying to engage in the public, looking at not only creating a community, but trying to better understand how we can manage our data to meet the demands of the community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brandon to sort of give a brief overview of where we're going next in the future.
What type of skills do you look for in your hackathons?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we are looking for anything in some sense. We've done some where it requires really no knowledge, and so in some cases we do things like OpenStreet mapping, where we can do a 1-hour tutorial and then you can go off and contribute. In other cases, if it's sort of more, app focused or something like that, it would require more technical skills. But
One thing I'll say as well is part of open data, a huge part of open data is engagement and listening. So we want to conclude this and definitely listen to your questions and focus on that for the remainder of the time. Very briefly, I'll just kind of focus on some next steps. So where do we head from here? We're focused really on systematic rollout and change management at the agency, and really getting our operating units to prioritize data as Laura mentioned for release, particularly those high priority data sets that folks like yourselves might identify. We will be enhancing our public engagement efforts. Being here tonight is certainly part of that, so we do thank you very much for the opportunity, and we'll be working on engaging with our partners to socialize this and to determine how we can better make the data they generate available to you. So we do welcome hearing from you. This is USAID's first ever open data policy. We recognize that we'll need to make some adjustments as well as we move ahead, and we most definitely welcome your input. So how can you provide that input or otherwise contribute to the discussion? Posting your question on sites like Stack Exchange or GitHub will help us answer those in a public forum where everyone can benefit from the answer. And certainly we're always available at opendata@usaid.gov. Finally, we have included a link to the Open Data Grant that Laura mentioned previously. And in spirit of continuing that discussion, we'd very much welcome any feedback or questions you might have.